welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host today, Jen, and today I am joined by the author of a delightfully funny book. I was just saying before we hit record that this is one of the funniest books I've read in a while. I'm so excited to talk about it. So welcome to the show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your book, please?
Sure. I'm Martin Cloutier. I'm the author of Waiting for Something Else.
Thank you for joining us. Before we talk about the book itself, could you tell us a little bit about your journey to writing and the inception for this book?
Well, it's been a long one, a very long one. I actually the first story I ever published in 2006 was about one of the characters in this book. And I started becoming really interested in these characters, and I published a couple different stories about James and Roger, both over the course of several years. And I just couldn't get this idea out of my mind. The idea being that, how do we are we sort of hardwired from birth to be a certain orientation, to be attracted to a certain type of person, and not just gay or straight, but are we hardwired to be attracted to our mothers or our fathers or the first person we had sex with or whatever? Does that imprint us in some way, or can we change it? And so that was the idea that fermented this book that kept percolating over the years. And, so finally I worked up a first draft of a novel, and I worked on that. And I've been working on it, ever since, for at least 15 years.
That answers one of the questions I was going to ask, which is why 2006? You answered it very succinctly.
Yeah. I thought, I never thought I was writing a historical novel. I was writing about Brooklyn and the gentrification of Brooklyn that was happening and all the changes, which were significant, that were happening around me in 2006. And then it just took me 20 years to publish it. So it turned out to be an historical novel. It wasn't my intention.
That's cool. Yeah, well, genres certainly aren't fixed, so you can go from contemporary fiction to historical fiction over time. That's very interesting. So I was living in Brooklyn in 2006. I had a pretty brief stint there before I moved back to Long Island for libraries. I love how you evoke Brooklyn at that time, how we thought it was really gentrified at the time. I think how much more gentrified it's become has sort of revealed that it was pretty early in those stages at that time, but it was still getting there. Certainly you have your own remembrances, but was there research that you did in order to evoke Brooklyn, roughly 20 years ago now, to recall,
Well, yeah, there were a lot. I had to, go back into my memory banks. I mean, I've lived in Brooklyn now for 25 years, but I still had to go back in my memory banks. I did a lot of searching on Google Street, looking at the streets and going back to, 2011, 2010 to look at the different streetscapes then. And it's also part of living in New York. Like, New York is a city sort of, every 20 or 30 years, it becomes a completely different city. So it's not at this particular time. There's a part in the book where, some of the characters talk about Times Square and how that's changed over, the last 3 or 4 decades. And so I went back and I did a lot of research, because that was really before I came to New York. So I did a lot of research on, the porn houses and the gay bars and the video arcades and everything that was around Times Square in the 80s. And I did a lot of research on that too. But New York changes constantly. Like, if you look back on, the reason Park Avenue is called Park Avenue is because in the 20s, there used to be a park alongside of Park Avenue. There was like a very sort of meandering, curvaceous park that went along Park Avenue. And of course, that's all gone now. So, I mean, New York constantly keeps changing, and we keep reinventing the city and, tearing down our history and building new. So that also worked into the sort of theme of the book about how people can change their identities and change their sort of orientations, perhaps over time as well, just like the city of New York.
Oh, that's a lovely resonance there. So let's talk about one of these characters, James. Well, first off, the opening scene of James sort of working in his restaurant it gave me like legit flashbacks to being a waiter in New York City and how stressful it was and how overstimulating it was. So well done there. Could you talk about shaping James as, one of the characters from whose perspective you tell the story?
Well, he's a born Jewish Buddhist. He was raised Buddhist, even though his parents are sort of well, his father is Jewish, but gave up the religion and turned Buddhist. So he's not really religious in the Jewish sense, but he does have that background. And, he comes from the Midwest. So I was born in Detroit, so I come out of the Midwest too. So I can understand that sensibility, which is a very different sensibility from New York. And so there's a politeness, there's a niceness, there's a not sort of, you know, talking about your gripes and your wants and your needs as much as New Yorkers do. So there's all that sort of built into James. And he's very much alone in the city, and he hasn't had any, friends for he's been here for 9 months, and he hasn't had any friends, and he certainly hasn't had any girlfriends. And in Michigan, he hasn't had very much luck with his girlfriends. He's had a couple, but they haven't been really successful relationships. And so he's really lonely. And he meets, he's been working alongside of Roger at this restaurant, who's this sort of very, outgoing, cynical, satirical, sarcastic playwright, very promiscuous. And Roger is sort of giving him some sexual attention that he really, really craves. He wishes it wasn't from Roger, but it's the only sexual attention he's getting. And he also wants to be an animator, and he works with puppets, and he tries to make these little animated films with puppets. And Roger is a playwright, and Roger sort of respects what he's doing. He respects his art. And he can help him advance his career and give him the encouragement that he's so lacking in his life. So there's lots of reasons that he becomes attracted to Roger, but none of them are sexual, really. So he sort of goes along with it, and Roger becomes attracted to him. Roger is usually attracted to very muscular, very put together guys who are good looking and superficial on the surface. And he sees in James a depth of feeling and perception that, he hasn't experienced before. And so that's the change in Roger that makes him sort of say, well, maybe I don't have to be attracted to these really good looking people all the time.
Mhm.
And so they sort of try to come together, both romantically and sexually.
I do love their relationship and their banter. It is extremely funny. And making it even more funny is sort of like the third, I guess, angle of the triangle, Shelley. Let's talk about her a little bit and sort of maybe how you use the character's relationship to generate humor. Because, when you describe the plot and the relationship between these characters, there's like an almost, like 1930s screwball energy to it a little bit. It has like that sort of zaniness to it.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's a lot of sex in the book, and I think, sex is like a great way to reveal character, but none of it is satisfying, sex that, blows your mind. It's all very awkward, uncomfortable. I mean, I'm using sex in a way to sort of get into the characters' heads and sort of, reveal their sort of, flaws and quirks and where they're withholding. And Shelley falls in love with Roger. She ends up, through a series of circumstances, moving in with him as a roommate, and they develop a great friendship. And she ends up falling in love with him. And, they have sex together, and it's pretty good for her, and it's not great for Roger. And so then they have to deal with the aftermath of that. And yeah, there's no satisfying sex, but there's a lot of it.
Yeah. That's true. And that is very funny. And I think that that is probably more on par with how most people experience sex in their everyday lives. It's not always mind-blowing or, romantic or looking like it should come out of a movie. Like yeah, it's often awkward and fumbling and vulnerable and weird. So,
And it's such a great way to reveal character. I mean, it's really, I mean, there's sex in almost all of my fiction in some respect. And it's a way to show, it's the part where people are the most vulnerable and the most sort of uptight too about their feelings and their expressions, and it just can reveal so much about a character. And it's active. You're doing it too, and there's a power relationship, and there's all these different kinds of aspects to the sex act itself, and it puts people in their most vulnerable place. So I'm not sure why, well, I mean, I am sure why a lot of authors don't use it, but I mean, I think they should because it's just such a great way to reveal character.
mm. Yeah, great at revealing character and generating plot, because sex has the potential to sort of irrevocably change things between people and, and that like generates stories. So.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'd love to talk about the title and sort of the role of waiting, if that's okay. A lot of characters, or well, no, James in particular is sort of in a period of his life that feels like a lot of waiting. And I was thinking about how his journey with regards to that is sort of like his journey towards becoming the protagonist of his own story, in a way, because like you can't really be a protagonist if you are just waiting for things to happen to you, passive
Mhm.
forces don't generate story. So yeah, could you talk about like where in the process of writing this book did that emerge as a theme, and when did it present itself as a title? And I know that there was like a little bit of a debate over the title too. Is that right? Or
Well, yeah, I mean, I did have an agent for this book at one time, and we worked together for about a year revising the book, and she gave me a lot of great suggestions. And then when it came to the title, she's like, well, no one's going to know what this title means. It's really not good. You have to change it to something else. And she wanted to call it the Brooklyn Tagonists. And I was just like, well, that's awful. And I had built in, like, over the course of, all these years, I had built in this concept of waiting because, as you said, James is a character who's just waiting for a girlfriend to happen to him. He's waiting for his career to happen to him. He's not doing positive steps to make things happen to him. Shelley is the same way. She kind of wants to, like, have this makeup line that's all organic, but she's not doing anything to get it. And she's just going from boyfriend to relationship to help her satisfy it. Roger's a little bit more proactive in his career, but he's still wait in terms of a relationship. He's like not going after like a significant relationship. He's just waiting, for the love of his life to come to him. Meanwhile, while he's having all these sort of, hookups and affairs with cheap people. So they're all sort of just waiting for things to happen to them in different ways, and they're all waiters working at a restaurant, and I was a waiter for like 15 years of my life. So I mean, I know that whole role, and I've worked with many waiters who are doing the same thing. They're waiting for things to happen to them and not going out and pursuing them. So that was like a major theme of this book, and I sort of tried to weave it in many places. So I wasn't really ready to change that title. That title was really something that was important to me that I thought was a major theme of the book. And so and anyway, that agent ended up parting ways with me because I wouldn't change the book, the title of the book. So that was kind of like, wow. But that tells you something about our industry, if like, and has she left? This was on the phone. She said, well, let me tell you three things, three truths, Martin. One, you're author of a certain age. Two, you have a niche product that's very hard to sort of sell. And three, you don't have a lot of other work in the pipeline. So you're not really attractive to a lot of publishers. And I was like, okay, well, I mean, you're probably right. I mean, that's probably right, but that's how she sort of ended our relationship. So
it was, I think you were correct. It's not, her proposed title was not very good.
no, I wasn't going to call it the Brooklyn Antagonists ever.
No. Talking about, the idea our orientations as fluid or something that can change over time. In terms of the extremely complex and sort of shifting dynamics between our three main characters, how much plotting ahead of time was there? Did you try to direct the flow of their psychological development as they related to each other, or did you see as it emerged? I guess this is a strange way of asking, like, how prepared are you as you draft? Are you a big outliner? Do you know where it's going to go, or do you let the process take you?
Well, I like to outline a lot. And when I first started writing this novel, 20 some years ago, I really thought it would be that you can't change your orientation, that we're fixed, like we're fixed from life. And this was going to be, a romance that wasn't going anywhere and we can't be fluid. And I wrote a lot of drafts, towards that theme about that, because I really thought we are there's certain things about our nature that we can't change. And that's how I originally started writing this. And then as I started writing it and started exploring these characters and started, seeing more avenues and opportunities, I thought, well, maybe it's possible. Maybe they can change. And I started seeing things in my own life that had changed. Like, I've had several long-term relationships and they've mostly been with guys who were over 6'2". My 10-year relationship was with a man who was 6'2", and then I had another 5-year relationship before that with a guy who was 6'4". And then I was dating a lot of guys who were, that was my thing. It had to be over 6'2". I didn't, I'd meet a guy who was like 6 foot and I was like, oh, this just doesn't feel right. I can't do it. And so I thought I'm fixed. And let me tell you, if you're gay, even in New York City, it's very hard to find eligible bachelors over 6'2". Let me tell you, that is a very, very tiny minority of people. You have to factor in they have to be ready for a relationship and they have to be accessible and they have to be attracted to me. I mean, I was like really severely limiting myself. Um, so anyway, I did find that this was after being single in New York after my last relationship broke up for 10 years and dating and trying to find the perfect guy for me who was over 6'2". And I couldn't, that was hard. And so finally, after a while, I don't know what it was, if it was just, I settled, but something changed inside me. I didn't really seek to change it, but something changed inside me. And I met a guy, and I only met this guy because he told me online he was 6 foot. And when we met, he was my height. He was 5'10". And so instead of saying, oh, well, this is not going to work at all, I already thought I was compromising at 6 foot. I'm not going to go to 5'10" now. I went with it and we ended up having like, a great time. And I ended up being attracted to him. And we had a relationship for like several months. And I was like, oh, it's possible. Somehow I changed. I didn't really set out to change who I was attracted to, but I changed through that experience. And so then I started to think, well, maybe it's possible to change more things about yourself and your orientation. And, I'd always had female friends throughout my whole life. I was raised by a pack of women. And so I've always been really close to female friends. And I thought, well, maybe it's possible I could, change my orientation and be attracted to women. It's definitely possible. So I just started to explore all that, and mostly through the writing. And that's how I sort of came to this sort of idea that it might be possible.
Hmm. That's so interesting. And I wonder, how much that has to do with just sort of life phase and, because as I myself watch my own journey, there's a part of your life where maybe it's about shifting sort of our relationship to the rules that we use to sort of define our existence and the boundaries that we
Mhm.
draw around ourselves to demarcate like who we are. I
Right.
think you really cling to those when you're a little bit younger. And then as you age a little bit, I think you learn that like you actually kind of learn more about yourself, like when you occasionally step over those things or you break those rules or.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a growing process. And yeah, I do think when you're younger, you have all these rules and you probably need them to define yourself. But after you have a better sense of yourself, you can let go of some of those rules.
Mhm. Oh, so I'd love to ask you a question again to return to the humor and how you use it to develop character as well. I read another interview with you where you talk about you see one of your goals as telling the truth. How do you use humor to tell the truth? Because it occurred to me that like you can use humor to reveal the truth as like a lot of like satirical comedians or commentators do, but you can also sort of use humor to distance yourself from the truth and defend yourself from it or create a distance. So how do you see yourself using that?
Well, I mean, for me, for something to be funny, two things have to happen. One, it has to be at least partially true. So humor is often exaggerated, and I think you can exaggerate the truth for comic effect. But at least there has to be a kernel of truth in it. Otherwise, you're not going to relate. Your audience is not going to relate to it. So there has to be some kernel of truth, and then someone has to get hurt. And this is very controversial. But for me, it's not funny unless someone gets hurt through the humor. So it's either, you're either making fun of yourself or, sending yourself up in some comic way. I mean, Gary Steingart's very good at doing that. Or you're making fun of other people or someone else, something else, right? So something has to be hurt by what you're saying. Otherwise, there's no stakes. Otherwise, there has to be stakes to make something funny. So those are the two sort of components that I think are important that are humor for me, that are going to make me laugh. If it's just all like this nice, amicable kind of humor where, no one's getting hurt and you're not really commenting on anything, derogatory or negative, right? I mean, I think we're in a space now where no one wants to say anything negative. You can't punch down. Heaven forbid you punch down. Well, what can you punch up at? Of course, white men, that's white cis men, that's about the only targets. So that's too limiting. You have to be able to punch up and down and all over. And you have to be willing to hurt people. So those are the two components I look for humor. And there's one spot in the book where Roger's gay friends all get together. It's really actually my favorite part of the book, where they all get together for a birthday party and they completely destroy each other. I mean, they just insult after insult after insult, and it's just one on top of the other, and they're all fighting with each other, and it's terrible. And James, the boy from, the sweet boy, naive boy from the Midwest is listening to this and is going, "Oh my God, gay people are horrible. They're awful. Why are they doing this? I don't even want to be part of it." Right. And I think that's a lot of people's reaction. I think in the literary community, that's definitely a lot of people's reaction is humor can't be mean. You can't be mean. But for me, that's what makes it funny is the meanness. And it's also a way to deal with the conflicts of life, right? It's a coping mechanism. It's like I can say the worst terrible thing to you and you can recover from it and say it back to me. And and that's certainly something I later, bring in, that it's something that gay men, particularly of a certain age who grew up with AIDS in the 80s and 90s, have sort of had to deal with, like had to, when you're faced with so much tragedy, how do you cope with it and still go on? By making that tragedy funny, by finding the humor in it. And, also that's why there's so many great Jewish comedians as well, because they always had to live through so much tragedy. That's why there's so many great African American comedians, because they had to live through tragedy and they found a way to cope with it through humor. So that's, part of the ethos that I'm, talking about in this book, showing that, yeah, gay men can be vicious to each other, but it's a form of survival for them. And, because they grew up in a war zone, they grew up, even within their own families being thought of as being different. Even with the people who most loved them, they were still alienated from them. And then they had to go out into society and be told that they were, mentally ill or sick or immoral. And then with AIDS, they had to be told that they were, diseased. So it's a coping mechanism to deal with all these facts, to say, yeah, I may be diseased, I may be mentally ill and immoral. That's fine. What are you? So that's my type of humor, and it's mean and it's vicious, and that's what I like.
It's like a ritual of like breach and repair, 'cause that mean humor can, as you say, actually bring people closer together and create community and closeness. And what you were just saying reminded me of, I've often mused about like this sort of emotional arc of a lot of like drag performances that go from like despair to like sort of like transcendent manic joy, and sort of it feels like a sort of similar, almost like catharsis. Like,
Yeah, well, drag queens are the true artists of gay culture. I mean, I watch a lot of drag queens. I go to a lot of drag shows. I mean, I love drag. I love drag as an art form, and I love drag performers because they really have been out on the front lines of getting the ridicule and the hate from people, and they've turned it into a fantastic art. And they've made it funny, and so many of them are just hysterical. Drag, has been a great sort of artistic pinnacle of, gay culture.
gosh, well, I really did love this book, and I'm so excited to recommend it to people. What are you working on now? What's on your horizon?
Well, I'm working on another romance, but it's between a middle-aged dog walker from Brooklyn who's very, very liberal, who moves to Alabama and falls in love with a conservative Trump supporter. And who's very good looking, obviously. But I'm looking at ways in which we can bridge this divide in our country because we're at such political, polarization that it's just not healthy. And we have to find, common ground and we have to find a meeting ground. And we can't let the extremes of either ideology guide us. And I feel that's what's happening now, that the extreme people have the loudest voices on both sides of the spectrum. And there's a majority of people in the middle who, don't feel the same way and want to come together and can see both sides and can see things in both sides. And, there's a middle ground here that I really think it's necessary for us to find and come together. So that's what I'm working on.
Nice. Wow. And that now that you mentioned, that could be this year, that could be like today, this week, last week. Like it's all so very much in our faces right now. So I'm very excited to see that. Thank you for taking the time to talk to me and for sharing your book with me.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
So, listeners, please check out Waiting for Something Else. It's out now. It'll be out when you hear this. So, head to your favorite bookstore or library website, wherever you like to go for books. Do you have a favorite bookstore you like to send people to?
Well, my book is print on demand. So it is available in a couple bookstores in Brooklyn, Greenlight Bookstore. It is available in Word Bookstore, but for the most part, you need to go to Amazon or you can go to Barnes and Noble online and get it print on demand. That is an issue with having print on demand. You can't get it at all the bookstores, or you can go to your favorite bookstore and have them order it. It's published, it's distributed through Ingram, so they can order it for you at your favorite bookstore too.
Oh, nice. Well, if you are local, Word and Greenlight are both beautiful, amazing bookstores. So those are very two good places to check out. Thank you again. This has been really lovely.
Thanks a lot.
All right, it's time to close this chapter, everybody. We'll see you next time.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.